It's a real privilege and honor to interview today for the International Society of Nephrology, Professor Roscoe R. Robinson. Dr. Robinson, maybe you could start by telling us what led to your interest in medicine.
Well, without being too long-winded about it, Steve, I had not planned to go into medicine until I was a senior in college. I had planned to be a lawyer, had been enrolled in law school, and my mother had always wanted me to be a physician. I had resisted that. And my father died in my senior year in college, and the family gathered at the funeral, and they were all physicians, uncles and aunts and cousins, and they said, "You need to be a doctor." And they persuaded me that such should be so. So in the middle of the fall semester, I dropped a course in political science and enrolled in a 5-hour course in botany because I didn't even have the minimum requirements for entry into medical school. And the next semester, I took 20 hours of science and 12 or 15 the following summer after graduation from college, and 20 the next fall, and entered medical school the following September in 1950. So I entered medical school via a circuitous route, but I've been very pleased that I made that decision. Medicine has been good to me, and I hope it's been, and I hope I've been good to it.
How early in your medical career did you develop an interest in the kidney, and what led to that interest in the kidney?
I think I first became interested in the kidney when the wife of a classmate and very good friend developed postpartum acute renal failure. And we as medical students rotated sitting at her bedside and helping in her care as best we could. And of course, in that era, hypertonic glucose solution and all sorts of things like that were used in oliguric acute renal failure. Fortunately, she recovered, but it sparked an interest in things renal even in medical school. And then as a senior, we were required to spend 3 months on a preceptorship with a practicing physician. And I was fortunate enough to be assigned to one of the most remarkable practitioners I've ever been around, whose patients came from far away, even though he practiced in a very small and rural town on the banks of the Cimarron River in Oklahoma, and read constantly, tremendously well informed, was asked to give more than 2 or 3 AOA lectures at my medical school. And he introduced me to the writings of Homer Smith. Believe it or not, he introduced me to Homer Smith's University of Kansas lectures, which I just found fabulously intriguing and so well written and so clearly written. So like everyone else in the United States at the time, and to some considerable extent abroad, Homer Smith indirectly influenced me as well. I was introduced to his extracurricular writings, and it propelled a fascination with the kidney that remained. I was torn between the kidney or something related to the kidney and hematology, only because one of my mentors in medical school, a wonderful person who had come to the University of Oklahoma from Cornell, Bob Bird, was a hematologist, an exciting person to be around. And for at least 2 or 3 years, I toyed with the idea of going into hematology, but the kidney won out.
As your interest in nephrology and kidney diseases developed, and as your early career developed, could you reflect on who the other individuals were that you respected and that most influenced your career?
Well, you know, I went to Duke University as an intern. Eugene Stead was the chairman of the Department of Medicine at the time. It was a powerful Department of Medicine, I felt. Duke was not as widely recognized in 1954 as it is today, but it was a strong service. I was very pleased and felt very fortunate to be there. And during the course of 2 years on the House staff, I needed to decide what sort of specialty I wished to pursue, specialty training. I thought a lot about it, toyed a bit with the hematology issue I mentioned before, and finally decided that I would seek an experience in a kidney-related laboratory. At that time, there really were no organized training programs in nephrology, clinical training programs. Nephrology wasn't even used as a word in the United States in 1956. There were laboratories that were doing things kidney-wise. The ones that were best known, at least to me, were physiologically oriented. And I was familiar with a little Charles C. Thomas book entitled Uremia that had been written by Stan Bradley at Columbia. And it was one of the few books that of which I was aware that had anything to do with the kidney other than Homer Smith's book. And so I decided that maybe I might like to spend some time with Stan Bradley, who had worked with Homer Smith and had been involved in a lot of studies on renal hemodynamics, PAH secretion, etc. And the alternative was Don Selden. And a humorous little story, I think, is the fact that I was torn between whether I would apply to one place or the other. And I ran into John Hickam, who was at Duke at the time, the head of pulmonary, and was about to leave to become the chairman of the Department of Medicine at Indiana. And I ran into him, and he said, "Ike, where are you going next year on a fellowship?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to decide between Stan Bradley and Don Selden." And he said, "Well, if you go with Don, you'd sure better be up on your calculus." Well, I don't know what kind of a mathematician Don is, but I knew I wasn't up on my calculus, so that sent me hustling to New York. And I spent a year at Columbia Presbyterian. Unfortunately, Stan was editor of the Journal of Clinical Investigation at the time. And although I had a good year, we enjoyed New York a great deal, but unfortunately Stan was heavily involved at the moment in studies of splanchnic bed hemodynamics. I didn't do anything related to the kidney the entire year. I measured splanchnic blood volume and blood flow in hemorrhagic shock in dogs, and not a very productive study, as a matter of fact. We did some splanchnic blood flow and volume studies at different levels of PCO2 in humans. But other than that, I really secured no training directly relevant to the kidney during that year in New York. So you might say that when I went back to Duke as a chief resident the following year, I was still untrained in the world of the kidney. But in that era, I think that if you were interested in something, a lot of self-training went into these ventures.
Are there other individuals during this period or in a few years after that influenced your work and research and your continued interest in the kidney?
Well, when I returned to Duke, I was rather persuaded that academic medicine was not for me. As I mentioned earlier, there were many physicians in my family. Some of them kept wondering when I was going to finish my training and come home and join them in the practice of medicine. And but when I went back to Duke, I fell into the hands of a very good friend, almost a contemporary of mine, who had been the chief resident the year before my return, Vic Murdoch. And Vic, who subsequently left Duke to become the head of nephrology at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, I knew of my possible interest in the kidney, persuaded me to maintain that interest. I responded, and I began to do some very simple clinical studies looking at the effect of diuretics in humans with inulin clearance, filtration rate measurements on magnesium excretion. A little paper that was subsequently published, very simple little paper. And that was my inquiry during that year. We also looked a little bit at the effect of insulin on ADH activity and antidiuresis, the antidiuretic activity of insulin. And minor studies, but maintained my interest in the kidney. But more importantly, through Vic, who was looking at control of urea excretion in low protein diet with Bodil Schmidt-Nielsen at Duke, introduced me to Bodil. And through Bodil and Vic, we had been invited, or they had been invited, to participate in the weekly journal club in Chapel Hill, which at that time was run by Lou Welt. Carl Gottschalk was there, Bill Blythe, a lot of wonderful people, very strong, Ike Taylor, very strong group of people at the time, Walt Hollander. So once a week I was privileged to track along with them to Journal Club in Chapel Hill. So between my minor studies as a chief resident, what time I had to do minor studies, and my contacts with Bodil and Vic Murdoch, and participation in the Journal Club, my interest in the kidney rose to new heights. And I began to think, well, you know, maybe I might give this a whirl. And so I did.
Can you tell us about the areas of research or the specific research that you are most proud of in your career?
I think there are two answers to that question, Steve. I went into the Air Force at the end of my training at Duke. It's incredible to think how I handled all of this at that time. It would be impossible today. I had wanted an assignment to the USAF Wilford Hall Medical Center in San Antonio, which at that time, this was 1958, was under development and was scheduled to become, in the United States, the Air Force Major Tertiary Referral Center. They were interested in establishing a dialysis unit. I had never dialyzed a patient in my life. John Hickam, for whom Hickam Field in Hawaii is named for John's father, had maintained a very active relationship with the Air Force. And through John's participation, I was able to secure an assignment to Wilford Hall to run the dialysis unit, and establish a dialysis unit. In that era, in many academic health centers, dialysis or kidney-related things really operated under the purview of cardiovascular area. The kidney was a subset of cardiology in this country, as was hypertension and a lot of other things. And so Duke Cardiology had invested in my last year at Duke a Colf twin coil machine. I can remember Lou Welt coming over to watch it perform. And I watched several dialyses at Duke, not many, maybe 6 or 7 or 8, and constructed a list of equipment, sent it to the Air Force, and went to San Antonio. and established the dialysis unit, the first dialysis unit at Wilford Hall. That worked well. But before I went, I also sat down and wrote an NIH research grant application. It was submitted through my friend Vic Murdoch in the University of Alabama. And so during my 2 years as a reservist in the Air Force, I was able to conduct a series of studies while I was in the Air Force that gave great pleasure to me. I had a lot of fun. I was fortunately left to do what I wished to do as long as I kept that dialysis unit going, because in those days there were barracks of heat stroke victims barracks that were maintained for heat stroke victims. And I never will forget during that tenure before my dialysis unit had really been established, a heat stroke patient came in, developed acute renal failure, and Paul Teschon was at Brooke Army at the time. And Paul had written what in that era was a wonderful 2 or 3 papers in the Green Journal, the American Journal of Medicine, about the acute renal failure experience in Korea during the Korean War. And I was very familiar with those papers. And so I referred this patient to Paul at Brooke Army Medical Center. I went over to visit my patient a couple of days after his transfer, and I never will forget. It was the most stunning experience of my life. Here was a patient with oliguric acute renal failure sitting up in bed eating a steak. And he had whatever he wanted every day. He was also being dialyzed every day. And that patient was in a small series that Paul published in the Annals of Internal Medicine on prophylactic hemodialysis. And it was a remarkable experience to me, because that was still the era when if one had acute renal failure, there were all sorts of things that you did, but that wasn't one of them. You certainly didn't have anything you wanted to eat, you know. So that was a wonderful experience. During that 2 years, I did a lot of things. I looked at the effect of prednisone on glucose titration curves in the kidney and presented that work. That was my first presentation at a national meeting. But probably the thing that has been most associated with me were some studies that colleagues and I did in patients who had what was thought to be benign proteinuria. And we used a very qualitative classification of asymptomatic proteinuria that we labeled fixed and reproducible orthostatic proteinuria, because almost all the time when you sought it out, it was there in the upright position in a qualitative sense. And renal biopsy was still relatively new, and we biopsied almost 60 such patients and then continued to follow them. And I participated in those follow-up studies over a 20-year period, and just recently a 30-year follow-up of most of those patients was completed by people who are now in the Air Force. And that study was probably the most widely quoted, and maybe the one that was most associated with me. But I think the one that I'm most proud of was one in which I was scooped, and I had decided to get into renal micropuncture. And I was going to have to be self-taught. I had a medical student at Duke who dropped out a year of school to spend that year in my laboratory. And I sent him to Dallas to work with Floyd Rector and learn what he could about the technique. That's curious that I would do that when Carl and Bill Lassiter were only 10 miles away. But that's the way we did it. And Jim came back and we set up a micropuncture lab. And for reasons that I will never fully understand, except for the fact that I had been doing other studies on ammonia excretion with another close colleague and good friend in Duke GI, Gene Owen, and we had been looking at renal uptake of amino acids in various forms of acidosis and what have you in humans, and interested in ammonia excretion and production. And that led then to an interest in ammonia, and Carl Ulrich had published a ultra-micro method for measuring ammonia. A very tough method, I might add. But we finally thought that we had it well enough in hand that we could apply it. And we did, and the first series of studies really demonstrated, I think, the net addition of ammonia to the collecting duct. No question about that. I was excited about that finding. And it could have only come from across the loop, we felt. But just before my paper went in, Gerhard Giebisch had one on the same subject. So we were scooped, but I was always proud of that study, even though we were scooped. It certainly was done independently, and it was a lot of work and a tough drill in that era.
Could you tell us more about the early years in the development of nephrology at Duke and the nephrology division, and maybe reflect a bit and put it in context on what was happening in American nephrology during that period?
I went back to Duke in 1960 out of the Air Force after my 2 years of service, which I had enjoyed very much. And first began to work with Gene Owen. Gene had earlier developed an interest in ammonia metabolism in general because of his interest in the liver. And we really, I thought, made a great partnership. Duke had no official divisional organization in nephrology. I don't remember even being aware of the fact that Homberger had organized or was organizing what was to become the first International Congress of Nephrology the same year I returned to Duke. My first recollection of an ISN Congress was the Prague Congress in 1963, when I was still a very junior member of the Duke faculty. I like to say that when I looked below the academic ladder, there was no one there. And I remember there was an NIH, maybe perhaps, I don't remember exactly the source of funding, but there was an NIH or some organizational support for travel grants to the Prague meeting for which one could apply. I applied unsuccessfully, so I didn't make the Prague meeting. Nephrology wasn't even a word in this country, at least it was not one that had surfaced in my awareness. When I returned to Duke, it was unclear what my role would be. I returned as a clinical investigator in the VA, in the Durham VA hospital. There was no formal structure. I resumed my contact with Bodil, and Bodil and I did several things together that focused on urea for the most part and regulation of urea excretion. It was a wonderful training period for me. Another colleague at Duke who had come during my absence in the Air Force was Dick Portwood, who had research laboratory training with Don Selden in Dallas. And it was unclear whether Dick was going to lead the development of nephrology or not. At the time, I felt it was my interest to really remain focused in the laboratory And I did my best to do that and resisted as much as I could being drawn into clinical work at the time, while Dick was pretty much doing the dialyses that needed to be done at that time. Dick and I did some studies in the chicken, looking at tubular secretion in that animal model, and also looking at urea production by the chicken kidney. And that was fun. Dick subsequently decided that leadership of an academic division was not what he wished to do. And Dr. Stead, Gene Stead, came to me and asked me, maybe I don't remember exactly, 61, 62, if I would get together or begin to think about doing whatever Duke would do in the kidney. A little bit later, he came to me and suggested that there were things going on in Seattle that we needed to know about. This was probably a year or two after the first chronic dialysis in Seattle burst on the scene in 1960. And I had identified my first fellow, Charles Chuck Hayes, who had returned to Duke. And I talked with Chuck, and Chuck went to Seattle and spent, I don't remember how long, several weeks in Seattle, and came back to Duke and put us in the dialysis business, chronic dialysis business, very successfully. By 1962 or 3, the word nephrology was beginning to be bannered around, and I give a lot of credit to Homberger's choice of that word and its application to the first international Congress. There are some who say that Homberger coined that word. That's not so, but he certainly popularized it and used it extensively. The French renamed their society to the French Society of Nephrology. It became a very popular word, so I just decided I would put on our letterhead Division of Nephrology. I didn't ask anyone if I could do that, I just did it. I think that period of time in the United States was an exciting period. Oh, you know, renal biopsy had burst on the scene, percutaneous renal biopsy in the prone position had literally burst on the scene in 1954. Serial renal biopsies were being performed. People were learning things about renal morphology that had not been existent before. The physiology business was booming. Renal micropuncture was current and choice. And at least in the United States, and I again think because of Homer Smith's tremendous influence on our world in that era, I think that the leadership of this entire effort was mainly physiologically oriented and included some wonderful people, wonderful biomedical scientists who were also, many of them, good clinicians, and they set the stage for what was to follow. Now, in the early 60s, and I was largely unaware of this, I being a very junior person at the time, but there was a lot of struggling for leadership, I think, within the various groups. The first organization in this country of which I'm aware was the American Society for Artificial Internal Organs, which held its first meeting, I believe, in 1950. And it obviously began thinking of artificial organs. But it later became very involved in dialysis, and that involvement grew exponentially after the introduction of chronic dialysis in 1960. And as you know, the old Nephrosis Foundation, which had originally been populated largely by pediatricians who were interested in childhood nephrosis, evolved with a few bumps and turns into what is today the National Kidney Foundation, but not without some political machinations that were a struggle for some. And it really was not until 1966 that the American Society of Nephrology was founded, and the first meeting was not held until 1967. So during that early period in the 60s, most investigators in this country were totally committed to well-established and very prestigious annual meetings. The Atlantic City meetings, the Federation meetings, and to their relevant journals, the American Journal of Physiology, the Journal of Clinical Investigation, and had no or limited interest in new journals. They thought there were enough meetings, there were enough journals, and these were quality events, and therefore we didn't need any new societies, including an American Society of Nephrology. So the other organization that was active in all of this was the renal section of the Council on Circulation of the American Heart Association, which in the early 60s, and I'm not sure of the dates, was chaired by John Merrill at Harvard. And for reasons that I've never fully understood, John was a bit of an outsider when, as viewed by the more physiologically oriented leadership at the time. I don't know whether it was because of his early and very forceful and wonderful involvement with the rotating drum kidney, and there's a spectacular, I think, even today, if you go back and read them, series of papers in the JCI that were the output of his work. And even in that era, you know, if you interned at the Brigham, you had a month on the artificial kidney rotation. It was so new and so spectacular and what have you. But John was marched to his own drum. I thought it was a wonderful drum. I thought the world of John Merrill. A gentleman. He had struck a very early association with Jean Berger. They met during a visit in Paris. John Merrill was on leave in Cambridge, I believe it was, and took some time to visit Berger in Paris in 1953. And because John spoke fluent French, they struck up a very close personal friendship that existed until John's death. So John Merrill's association with the French was very close. And another person in that time, a little later, in the same category would be Mort Maxwell from Cedars-Sinai and UCLA, who also was very close to the people in Paris at the time. Anyway, I was largely unaware in the early 60s of all these shenanigans about who was organizationally was going to represent nephrology. Keep in mind, Steve, there wasn't even a textbook of nephrology in 62 or 63. And the first textbook of note in the country, obviously, was the one that Maury Strauss and Lou Welt put together. And I don't remember the first year that it appeared, but it was later. I can even remember as a confident youngster talking to some of my contemporaries, young pups. You know, we ought to get together and write a textbook about all this business. There wasn't one. So the division of nephrology, I accepted Dr. Stead's offer to develop a division of nephrology. And we had to carve out from existing services what we would do clinically. Operating a dialysis program came with the territory. Couldn't do anything about that. We wanted to do something about it and did. It led us into transplantation. Duke did not. We did our first transplant in 1965, and I had a great time with Bernie Amos had been recruited to Duke, and Bernard was a leading histocompatibility type who made many contributions to understanding that. And with Del Stickle and Jim Glenn And our group, which by then had grown to include Jim Clapp, Tom Andreoli, Greg Tischer joined us a bit later, and Cauley Gunnels, we felt we were really developing a full-service nephrology group with all the things. For a long time, all of the renal arteriography in Duke Medical Center was done by our group with our own hands, until one day Dr. Stead came to me and said, Ike, we're getting a new chief of radiology who wants to get into invasive radiology and wants to do the arteriography, and we've all agreed that he can, but you can continue to do them, you just can't charge for them anymore. So we sort of drifted out of the business of doing renal arteriograms. But I think of no time that was more exciting than the 60s. There was so much going on. Transplantation was bursting upon the scene. Histocompatibility testing was beginning to come on board. Immunosuppressive treatment. When you think about it, 6MP really didn't hit the scene until 1960 or 61. And what an impact it had. We don't think about it today, but let me tell you, we thought about it a lot then. So it was a good time. I remember the first meeting of the American Society in Los Angeles. Neil Bricker was the first president, wonderful friend, and I just thought it was the best meeting I'd ever attended. I thought it was so exciting. I was so pleased that nephrology was coming together and that we were having a meeting. It followed a year after the Washington meeting, which was the third International Congress of Nephrology, that Bob Berliner and George Schreiner had run effectively, and had been a very strong meeting that had attracted over 2,000 people from around the world. It was really the first of the large meetings, and they did a wonderful job of putting it on. It was a superior meeting, I thought, surrounded by a lot of social events. Now, parenthetically, I think it also set the pace for some issues that were to surround and to some extent plague subsequent Congresses for years. As I remember, there were 75 invited speakers at the Washington meeting who participated in a large number of symposia. The symposia were largely state-of-the-art symposia, what's going on in this area or that. So you might say they were sort of continuing education or update kinds of talks. And only about a third of the free communications were presented orally there. I don't think there were poster sessions at that time. And I think it's very difficult to have a triennial meeting and expect that first presentations of cutting-edge discovery are going to wait 3 years to be presented. And therefore, it meant that from the very beginning, the international congresses would tend to be heavily weighed with reviews and state-of-the-art sorts of things, which I think meant that fact plus the infrequency of the meetings meant that this meeting from the very beginning was not destined to become a place where one wanted to first present one's results. The prestigious meetings in the United States still occupied that platform. It's a problem that has, I think, plagued the Congresses for some time. And also it set in place the business that and especially in the United States, a feeling that, gee, if you went to an international Congress, somebody needed to pay your way. or you need to be an invited speaker, or maybe you might not go. And I think that was too bad too. I think it really sort of hamstrung a bit the organization of the format, unless one just accepted that the purpose of these meetings is really to provide an inventory of what's going on in nephrology in the year in which the Congress is held, which is not a bad objective when you look at it that way.
Could you look at and tell us about your initial involvements with, other than a participant and spectator, but involvement in the International Society of Nephrology, and in particular involvement with the Society's journal, Kidney International?
Steve, I can tell you that for the first decade of the Society's existence, I, for one, did not know how one became a member of the International Society of Nephrology. One of the controversies I now know within its executive committee and leadership in the 60s was whether the society would be an elitist society in which membership would be extended to those with certain qualifications. The first meeting in Evian in 1960 was by invitation only. And that was Homberger's view. There were others who felt that membership should be more open, as is the case today in the American Society of Nephrology, for example. And that debate existed throughout the 60s. The first constitution provided for two kinds of memberships. One, you could become a member through a participating national society, of which there were very few in 1960. The Italian Society, the Swedish Society, the Renal Association in the UK, the French Society. I think that was about it at the time in Europe, nothing in the United States. The Japanese Society held its first meeting in 1959. And so it's still unclear by what criteria membership in national societies would be evaluated. Whether a national society would just provide a list of its members and that you therefore were a member of the ISN. And then you could become an individual member if you existed in a country that had no national society, but the process was terribly complicated. It had to be approved by the General Assembly or some such organization. Would have taken months for that to wend its way through. And I don't think anybody understood all that. I can remember for a time thinking that if you subscribed to Nephron, which had its first issue in 1964 as the Society's journal, that you were a member. That wasn't the case. Dues and subscription were not coupled. But I didn't know. I didn't think much of the International Society. The only thing I knew that it did, which was the only thing it did, were to hold these congresses every 3 years. And was that sufficient to make someone wish to be a member? Because you didn't have to be a member to go to the Congress, as events later developed. And so I really didn't know much about the International Society until I got a phone call in 1971, the spring of 1971, from Neil Bricker, who unbeknownst to me was the treasurer of the International Society of Nephrology. And he said, "Ike, how would you like to be the editor of Nephron?" Well, nothing had ever entered my mind of that sort. And I was sort of surprised, and I said, "Nephron has two editors, Gabriel Richet in Paris and George Schreiner in Washington, D.C. And another wonderful fellow named Jean Dormont, who was really carrying the bulk of the load in Paris and deserves great credit for his contributions to Nephron." I said to Neil, let me think about it and I'll get back to you. Well, I thought about it and I talked to the people in my group and concluded that I wanted to learn more about it. So I called Neil back and I said, yes, I'd like to know more about it. And he said, could you meet with me and Hugh DeWardner, who was president of the ISN at the time, and the representative of a publishing company, a German publishing company, Springer Verlag, at JFK Airport in New York. At that time, I was on the board of the directors of the American Heart Association and had been chairman of what had by now become the renal council, kidney council of the American Heart Association. And we timed that meeting with a time when I had to go to New York anyway for that meeting. And I remember we met in the empty dining room at a rather grungy airport hotel, and I was so impressed by Hugh DeWardner, who flew over that morning and flew back that night, because to me, I'd only been to Europe once, or maybe at most twice in my life, and if you went to Europe, my gosh, going in and coming in a day was unheard of. And but I was very impressed by Hugh. And so they explained to me the background at that meeting. I had a view of Nephron. I knew that Nephron had not been accepted in the United States. John Merrill campaigned vigorously for American support unsuccessfully. There was a wonderful symposium issue dedicated to Dr. Pitts, I think was a spectacular issue, that was presented to him, by the way, in a ceremony at the Stockholm Congress. But it really had not been accepted. It was not, Nephron was not receiving quality manuscripts from people in the United States. And I felt the same way about it. I felt that Nephron was a average at best journal that had really not made it. I still wanted my things, our things, in the American Journal of Physiology or the JCI or wherever. So I was very concerned about that, and I was very concerned whether or not my counterparts would support a journal. Hugh DeWardner, when he became president of the ISN, because of a terrible relationship with S. Karger, the publisher of Nephron, which effectively meant that the society had no financial control of its journal, which effectively meant that the publisher served as the society's treasurer, and which effectively meant that because as the journal grew, as Nephron grew, publishing expenses went up and there was never any profit to be returned to the society. So there were tense times between the society and the publisher, but the ISN had no money. I remember that in 1972 in Mexico City, at the Mexico City Congress, the society's coffers may have contained $6,000 or something. It was a pitifully small amount of money. And I have a copy of a wonderful letter from Jean-Louis Funk-Brentano, which replied to an earlier president of the ISN, Klaus Brun from Denmark, that said, you know, if you have no money, you are a beggar. What can we do? Well, Hugh DeWardner decided it was time for drastic change. And although Hugh has subsequently been criticized by some for his methods, I think in retrospect it has been proven he was correct, and I think he made the right decisions. He decided that if he could not renegotiate the contract with Karger, and if he could not expand the editorial board with influential leadership in North America, that he would have to seek a new publisher and a new contract. And he was unsuccessful in his attempt to negotiate a new contract with Karger, which led him to visit Heidelberg and Springer. He was impressed by them and felt that they would help us get underway appropriately. with a much more favorable contract. And in that discussion, it was learned that the title Nephron belonged to Cargill, not the society. Another example of the onerous terms of that first contract. So Hugh had decided that Springer should be the publisher and that we would start this new journal, and he suggested the name Kidney, which was fine to me. And I said, after our meeting at JFK, let me go home and think about this, and I will get back to both of you. I was inclined to do it, no question about it. But before I did one more thing, I wanted to know what people in the United States thought about this venture. I spent 2 days on the telephone. I called everybody I knew in American nephrology, and I laid it out to them. I said, if we do this thing, are you guys going to help out? Because if you tell me you're not sure, or if you tell me you're going to send everything to the HAP, or what have you, and if you're not going to let us have a little of it, then I have no interest in getting involved. But, and I turned to several people to help me assemble what I hoped would be an editorial board that would send a strong signal about interest and support for the venture. And then felt that I was getting enough reassurances, although I didn't get enough reassurances from everybody. But I think my contemporaries, who were in my age group, were very supportive. And subsequently that generally has proven to be the case, I think. So I called Neil back and said, okay, I'll do it. And that's the way it all began. It was a very interesting time. Craig Tischer agreed to be the associate editor, and Claude Amiel in Paris, who I had not met, did not know, but had been suggested by Richer, was going to run a Paris office, although it was very clear, in contrast to the earlier arrangement with Nephron, that there was only one editor, and the editor would be based in the United States, and the associate editor in Paris was playing a supportive role, helping in the review of manuscripts and that sort of thing. It was an arrangement that worked very well for me, and I think has worked very well for subsequent editors of KI. But it certainly smoothed some of the lines of communication. Now, I mentioned earlier that Hugh had been criticized for some of his approaches to resolution of this. Keep in mind the society had no money. It had no financial support to call a meeting of the executive committee, the council, or anything else. And Hugh had held two meetings. There were two meetings, one in the Atlantic City area in 1971 and one in London later, when he assembled as many people as he could. But there were some people on the executive committee who were left out and who subsequently felt that was inappropriate and that Hugh had been a little forward, if you will, in the way he made these kinds of decisions. And perhaps there may be some truth to that, but it was a form of forwardship, if you will, that looking back on it, I think was appropriate and turned out well, actually. And that was lucky too, perhaps. They had first approached Maury Strauss and asked Maury Strauss to become the editor of KI. And Maury was very attached to Little Brown, a very fine publisher, but based only in the United States. And Hugh felt that because of the internationality of this journal, that it needed to be associated with an internationally based publisher, which led to Springer Verlag, which had a New York office, in addition to its home base in Berlin and Heidelberg. And so for that reason, they reluctantly turned away from Maury, and that led to Neil's call to me. Hugh DeWardner did not know me. I'd never met Hugh DeWardner. He operated, I think, solely on Neil Bricker's recommendation, and I am not quite sure why Neil turned to me. I certainly was not an established editor. I never edited anything, and but Neil did, and so I did agree to take on the task. Craig had to go to England that summer of '71. We had to get an issue together by January of '72. 6 months we had. And Craig happened to have to go to England anyway. He was in the process of buying a new electron microscope, and he wanted to do some things in connection with that purchase in Britain. And he took a couple of days off and visited Richet in Paris, and that was our first official contact with the French office. I always felt badly that George, for some reason, felt that he had been George Schreiner had not been kept fully informed of all of these discussions, as he should have been. There's debate as to whether that was so or not. I'm not privy to who was right or who was wrong in that debate. But the other decision that Hugh made, that was to stir controversy that lasted for another 4 or 5 years, was whether or not dues should be coupled with subscription. It was my view, strongly held, that a successful journal would provide a very appropriate magnet for the attraction of membership in the society. I did not feel that just a triennial Congress was sufficient to do that. You didn't have to be a member to go to the Congresses. And I didn't, and because no one knew how you were even a member, at least I didn't know how you became a member of the ISN, at least it would clarify that as well. And so it was decided to couple dues with subscription. Well, as you can imagine, there were parts of the world who had been paying $2 for dues, or a small amount. I think it subsequently went up to $3 and maybe a little more. I don't remember or know exactly. And they didn't have to subscribe to Nephron. Now the first combined subscription for the journal, a monthly journal, not a bi-monthly journal, as Nephron was, with membership was $30. And that was quite a jump, coupled with the fact that the decision was not felt to have been made on the part of some in the most democratic way, led to some controversy that was to surround the journal. The other major problem at the beginning is that the society had the most tortured process for individual membership. You had to be sponsored by 2 members. An application had to be submitted to the Secretary General. When I came on board in '71, the Secretary General was Herman Villarreal in Mexico City. Postal communication with Mexico City was not the best. Herman would process the applications. The names then had to be forwarded to the treasurer in New York, and the treasurer would then forward the name to the publisher, and hopefully after about 6 months of this, a subscription would begin, and sometimes it was longer than that. It was a terrible system, most inefficient administrative structure I believe I've ever seen. Now, without getting into all the details, and thanks to Neil Bricker's leadership, and he was a very strong supporter and very important player in that period. Very important. I don't believe that KI could have begun to have done the things that I hope people think it is now done and has done and is doing, had it not been for the strong support that came from Neil during his tenure as treasurer of the society, and his help and support, and of course from Hugh de Wardner as the president. That's the way it all began.
Could you reflect